the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is openness to the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account available at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month to gain access to our Discord server, to reading groups that we've been conducting, and there's a bit of additional material available on the Patreon website for you guys. Some of the prior recordings that we've done of reading groups. Today, we're very excited to have a look at Order Out of Chaos, Man's New Dialogue with Nature from Ilya Prigogine and Isabel Stengers. We're going to focus on the introduction, Chapter 5, Chapter 6, Chapter 9, Chapter 7, the conclusions with some very light drawing material from Chapter 4.
I would have never pronounced his name right. I assume, what is it? Is it Russian? Is it Soviet?
He is,
like,
I think he's actually Belgian or something like that.
Belgian?
Yeah, something like that.
With maybe something mixed in, because I would have never known to pronounce it Prigogine with an extra, with a bit of a je. This is obviously a famous book. Famous, maybe not infamous. No, but it's
more than famous. Infamous, more than famous. Infamous.
I think it's a citation most people have seen, and I think they mention, I don't know if you're aware, but they mention that in French, when it first came out, it was published with the name The New Alliance. I don't know why they decided to forego that title here, but Order Out of Chaos, A Man's New Dialogue with Nature, which I'm not thrilled about the subtitle, but it's important to keep in mind what they're trying to focus on throughout the book. And I don't know, I was pleasantly surprised most of all that they do a pretty good job of laying out for the layman some of the scientific and philosophical underpinnings of the issues. But that's a very broad take. What did you think broadly, I guess, before getting into the nitty gritty?
Oh, I think a lot of this is the kind of more, I don't know if I want to say hard science, but the more rigorous theoretical mechanism that is inspired the manuscript or aligns with some of the moves that I've been thinking through relative to the manuscript. And so I think that this focus on thermodynamics in particular is something that I find very interesting as it relates to economy and political economy and obviously Marx and so forth. I think there's a gentleman that was a Ukrainian doctor that wrote to Marx in the late, the 1870s, 1880s, right as thermodynamics are emerging. I don't know if Marx necessarily downplays this, but I think Engels in particular kind of downplays the implications of thermodynamics with a focus, kind of saying effectively that value is a social relation, which yes, but I feel like perhaps this is a missed opportunity for Marx and Marxism at its very nascent stage. So I think we're going to try and recuperate this critique and see where it takes us. And I will lay out the lay of the land for the audience before we get into the thick of the content, and that is that the episode's move will be that every time orthodoxy is claiming efficiency, Prigogine finds the opposite operation underneath that. Information becomes erasure, optimization becomes ideology, equilibrium seeking becomes entropy producing, spontaneous order becomes substrate consumption, and prediction becomes the destruction of the predicted. So those are kind of the general 4 or 5 moves that we're going to work through as we progress through the episode. I'm kind of curious about something you mentioned last night, that in reading the notes that I put together for the episode, you felt like this brought my notion of the gradient into clearer perspective for you. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that, if you wouldn't mind maybe talking about that a little bit, because I think that sort of will be in the background of the episode relative to dissipative structures and
Mhm.
noise and so forth, chaos, order, like all of that is, obviously I think amortization is the logic of amortization and the logic of the gradient are effectively the same and are two different ways to articulate that. But I'm curious for your thoughts.
I think I had been coming to your idea of the gradient a little bit too much. Take a step back. I think this shows the way that they lay out in the book. They work us through step by step up through kind of classical science, dynamics, thermodynamics, etc. Right? They build kind of step by step, and the preconceptions and prejudices that filter in. So I think I was having trouble understanding your notion of the gradient because I was coming to it with the commonsensical type of notion that we find in classical physics, which is what Prigogine and Stengers lay out, where it's a world of reversibility, right? Of time and motion can be reversed, and we can kind of, another way of saying it, and this is a Simondonian thing, right? Is I wasn't thinking as clearly with respect to metastable systems. I was thinking more just kind of basic fundamental aspects of near equilibrium systems rather than metastable or far from equilibrium systems. So I think I had certain understandings of the gradient that were, if not wrong, very simplistic. And that's why it led me inevitably to some confusion. But I think working through this text and some of the stuff we did with Connor together, working through Henri Lon's work on complexity and self-organization, these things, I think it's a habit of my thinking and probably of classical Western thinking in general, as they lay out in this book, that stability, and again, to prejudice the Simondon attack, stability is not, it should not be taken as necessarily the paradigm of thought. And it's a habit that I should have already broken as a good Deleuzian. It shows I'm still lazy when it comes to certain things, or that I'm not yet thinking when I should be.
For me, I think where my skill set tips towards pattern recognition, which
Mm,
sometimes I think can fall into surface level homology. And I think that's what I have to guard against. But I think that's maybe where I'm have an elite, like as a 5 tool thinker. I
mhm,
wouldn't call myself a 5 tool thinker, but I would say, like, if you're thinking about the 5 tools of thought as a joke, as a
mhm,
baseball
mhm,
metaphor,
mhm,
then I have elite pattern recognition and maybe not, let's say, like the control, like I don't, you have the Greg Maddux
mm.
control and so forth, as opposed to me. But that's why we
Pattern
make
recognition is important to hit homers, right? Because if you can eliminate, uh,
pick up the ball, spin,
yeah,
etc. Yeah,
if you can
early.
eliminate one of those pitches coming and recognize the pattern, you're gonna slug.
It's good that we have different skill sets that we bring and can, I think,
Absolutely.
complement one another. And I think, yeah, I have this, maybe it's some type of schizophrenic, latent schizophrenic ability from smoking myself, schizoaffective or something like that. But
One
um,
last thing before we do the rundown. One thing I noticed, and this was just rereading last night, I did notice that at two different points, and they don't cite Simondon. They do cite Michel Serre, as you notice, right? And like the hydraulic, his study on Lucretius, the laminar flow becoming turbulent, things like this. So a little bit of the work we did a couple years back might have paved some of the foundation for some of these things. But the I did notice that they seize upon two terms of resonance and communication. And these are like terms that Simondon himself takes up and wants to transform and conceptualize. And so I think that it shows not so much that they were influenced by Simondon, but how much Simondon was actually kind of in dialogue with these terms, these concepts that were filtering in and out of science, and that I didn't realize as much that there was much more continuity in these terms that Simondon's taking up for his own purposes with the scientific communities at the time. That's my hypothesis, at least. And I know it's a big aside, but it's interesting. It would be interesting to see more on the notion of resonance communication, things like that, in the, I guess, 20th century scientific fields that all three of these thinkers are drawing upon.
First, to sort of lay a little bit of background in terms of order out of chaos, this is not an attempt to, like a science popularization move. It's a polemic against what may refer to as the Laplacian image of nature, and the image is the philosophical substrate of what would compromise classical political economy. And this is sort of attacking that image from the physics side, which kills the orthodoxy on our side, on the political economy side. So a polemical book, not a popularization. The argument against the classical worldview, which would be reversible, deterministic, timeless, and mechanical. And the image that they're attacking is the same one that Leon Walras, I am the walrus, they would import into economics in the 1870s. Founding neoclassicals borrowed explicitly from the 19th century energetics. Hayek inherits this, where every equilibrium claim in mainstream economics tacitly assumes it. If physics itself was wrong about time and irreversibility, then the economic transposition is doubly wrong. And I'll read a quote from the introduction, page 9, from the text. This leads to a new view of matter in which matter is no longer the passive substance described in the mechanistic worldview, but is associated with spontaneous activity. From the very first quote, we can already see the resonance with Simondon. This opening line is already our manuscript's deepest point of contact with Prigogine, even deeper than the gradient mapping that Taylor and I discussed briefly earlier. Matter no longer passive, but associated with spontaneous activity is the refusal of hylomorphism in a single sentence. Form is not stamped onto inert matter from the outside, like the mold, the sovereign, capital, etc. It arises from matter's own activity. That active matter, I would posit, is Simondon's metastable pre-individual. Now, the stakes for our manuscript, with the working title of Chronos Unbound, is that this gradient apparatus has been Prigoginian all along, and this episode is where we're going to work through the explicit recognition of that. The gradient is equal to far from equilibrium phenomenon. Amortization is equal to entropy production with a balance sheet, and the petit mort A equals the local accounting of Prigogine's entropy barrier. Our polemical frame, what we're attacking today, we're demolishing the classical worldview, but in better detail than that. There's I think, a universalist delusion at play that claims that everything is reducible to these reversible mechanical interactions among interchangeable particles. And you can see the Simondonian, like the hylomorphic critique, embedded in that statement, right? Because even working towards through the Richard Seaford material about coinage and how coinage provides the way to make bodies interchangeable and commodities interchangeable, etc., right? So I think that's just something to think. This is where the political economy, the economic, whatever, energetics of economy or something like that resonates. There's something called Laplace's demon, who symbolizes this kind of delusion. And I will read from, which is kind of associated with this external observer, rather, that has total predictive access. So one could think of Paul Moadib, the Kwisatz-Haderach, as an example of that type of a figure. But I will read from chapter 2, page 75. Extrapolations from the dynamic description discussed above have a symbol. The demon imagined by Laplace, capable at any given instant of observing the position and velocity of each mass that forms part of the universe, and of inferring its evolution both towards the past and toward the future. What the image actually claims, for anyone who is unfamiliar with Laplace, he, around 1814, imagined an intelligence that knew the exact position and speed of every particle in the universe. And for that type of intelligence, nothing would be uncertain. The whole past and the whole future would sit open to view, computed from the present moment. So very clearly, you can see the parallels with Paul Muad'Dib, with the Kwisatz Haderach, because of access to the ancestral memories, but also the ability to see the future pathways. Very direct metaphor there. Now, there's 4 commitments that are bundled into that picture of Laplace's demon. The first of those is determinism. The present state fixes the future completely, and there are no genuine forks. Number 2, reversibility. The laws run the same backward and forward, so time has no built-in direction. For example, you could run the film in reverse, and the physics would look identical. Number 3, total predictability in principle. So nothing genuinely new ever occurs because the future is already implicit in the past, and surprise is a measure of our own ignorance. So think in terms of Leibniz. God has selected the best of all possible worlds, and we simply do not know. We simply, in our limited scope as a monad, our windowless monad, we lack the vision to understand the greater hand of providence, God's will, etc. Number 4 is the view from outside. The knower stands apart from the system and pays nothing to observe it. What's really interesting here is the implicit cost of the observation, of the viewer. This is something that I think is very cool that Herbert goes through in Dune Messiah with respect to the costs associated with prescience. I just want to throw that out there for anyone who's interested in that side of the discussion, but I'll move forward. This sort of mechanical, classical physics, etc., becomes the picture, becomes the dominant paradigm, maybe the mode of like the image of thought or something, with the small I image of thought, where rigor meant reducing a thing to particles under fixed laws that is predictable forever in principle, and that's exactly the image that Prigogine and Stengers set out to demolish here, because real systems are open, they operate far from equilibrium, they're irreversible, genuinely historical, and unpredictable right at the turning points that actually matter. Why this matters for us is that the demon is the philosophical ancestor of Hayek's distributed cognition market, a mechanism that achieves what no individual could, but in principle reconstructs the same total predictable view, right? For Hayek, he's against central planning. There's no single human that can produce the elegance of the theodical economy, let's say, the theodicy of economics that would have a resonance with this, what I've argued in the past under Leibniz, and like money being the universal medium mode of exchange between not only commodities, but bodies and so forth. Moving on to Leon Walras. He was one of the 3 founders of what would be referred to as the marginalist revolution in the 1870s, and the author of general equilibrium theory. And his elements of pure economics modeled the entire economy as a system of simultaneous equations that settles to a single set of prices and every market clearing at once. He built this explicitly on classical mechanics, and his goal was to make economics, or he wanted economics to be sort of this physico-mathematical science, and borrowed a lot of the equilibrium apparatus straight out of 19th century physics, where prices behave like forces, the market settles to rest the way a mechanical system relaxes to equilibrium. And so the Walrasian economy is the Laplacian universe under different clothes and different guise. So there's deterministic, equilibrium seeking, timeless, and reversible. You demolish this sort of classical physics image, and the economic ideology built on it kind of falls apart. And that's the wager that we're going to make throughout the episode. If you want to look into the background of this, you can take a look at Philip Morosky's More Heat Than Light, which documents how thoroughly the marginalists copied 19th century energetics down to mistaking utility for energy. Hayek himself inherits this equilibrium frame and adds the information twist, where the market is a distributed computer which we'll discuss a bit later. A second issue or something is Quetelet. Have you heard of this Quetelet? Am I saying that
No,
right?
I'm not familiar.
Quetelet is the statistical walrus. Quetelet, I think, is a statistician. If you think the word normal and normal distribution, this is already encoding equilibrium as default ideology. And Quetelet imported the astronomical error curve into social statistics beginning in the 1830s with L'homme moyen, the average man, treating human variations as an error around an ideal mean. So the same move as Walrus with mechanics, made with statistics, and we'll look at an inversion of this where the normal distribution is the distribution of the dead, and that we'll discuss in section 3. Another note here relative to the text today is that we don't want to necessarily underweight Isabel Stenger's contribution because she is bringing the continental apparatus where Prigogine is doing the more technical, less philosophical work. So there are references to Bergson, Whitehead, and then Reenchantment. And so just keep that in mind. She has a later book, Cosmopolitics, that sort of extends the program of this text if you are interested in following that thread.
She's got a book on Whitehead too, just directly. Friend of the show, Grant Maxwell, has written recently on Stengers with a focus on her Whiteheadian inspiration. So
Maybe you can preface this part of the discussion as energy and the industrial age, thermodynamics born in smoke, where thermodynamics is the science of industrial civilization. So Carnot and the heat energy, free energy, all born from the project of extracting work from steam. To quote page 103, the rapid spread of the British steam engine brought about a new interest in the mechanical effect of heat. And thermodynamics, born out of this interest, was thus not so much concerned with the nature of heat as with heat's possibilities for producing mechanical energy. This conceptual vocabulary we use to critique capital comes from the historical moment of capital's intensification. And thermodynamics is what capitalism dreamed about itself when it tried to optimize its own metabolism. The science of work, efficiency, and dissipation arises from the regime that science is later turned against. The bridge to Bataille here is that Carnot tells you what the fraction of the energy gradient or what fraction of the energy gradient becomes useful work. The remainder, the necessary dissipation, is structurally the accursed share, and Bataille's general economy is the thermodynamic ledger Carnot inaugurates and that classical economics refuses to maintain. Bataille isn't being metaphorical when he discusses solar excess. This is an interesting part of the discussion, looking at the 3 stages of thermodynamics and Carnot versus Darwin. So 3 different regimes to keep in mind here. Equilibrium with maximal entropy, random behavior, and no structure and no time. 2, linear near equilibrium, small perturbations, linear response, predictable return. The regime classical economics implicitly assumes. 3, far from equilibrium. So nonlinear behavior, fluctuations get amplified, dissipative structures emerge, and genuine novelty is actually possible. The polemical claim is that reality is far from equilibrium across any scale that actually matters, and equilibrium is a special case and not the norm. The bell curve is the equilibrium distribution. The Gaussian is the maximum entropy distribution for a fixed variance, and the equilibrium velocity distribution of a gas, so the Maxwell-Boltzmann, is Gaussian. As you move further and further from equilibrium, this breaks down, and at turning points you get power laws, scale-free and heavy-tailed with no characteristic scale. Bell curve here, power law there. Mainstream finance is built on the Gaussian, so Black-Scholes value at risk. So 2008 was, for example, a far from equilibrium reality with fat tails, a crash that equaled the size of the mean, which destroys the equilibrium statistics. Mandelbrot himself said that markets were non-Gaussian for like 50 years and was ignored because the bell curve was institutionally load-bearing, let's say. Back to Darwin and Carnot here, there's a paradox at play because classical thermodynamics says that isolated systems run down towards disorder. But on the other side, biological evolution is saying organized complexity persistently arises. The systems we care about are not isolated. And I have a quote from the text to draw that out a bit further. This is from page 127, chapter 5. When we examine a biological cell or a city, however, the situation is quite different. Not only are these systems open, but they also exist only because they are open. They feed on the flux of matter and energy coming to them from the outside world. We can isolate a crystal, but cities and cells die when cut off from their environment. They exist only because they are open. The cell and the city and capital are not entities that happen to be connected to an environment. They have their being in the throughput. You cut off the flow, and they don't simply become less active version of themselves. They cease to exist. The connection to the manuscript involves this sort of physics side statement of this dissipative structure ontology that the gradient depends on. So capital doesn't happen to consume living labor. Capital exists only in that consumption. Orthodoxy treats labor as an input among many, but through Prigogine, it's the constitutive throughput without which capital has no identity at all. A fourth move here is order through fluctuations. There's something called, let's see, as a dissipative structure, the Bénard cell. This is like if you heat up fluid from the bottom, this creates a vertical temperature gradient. So there's a below threshold where heat moves by conduction, and an above threshold where fluid spontaneously organizes into these hexagonal convection cells. What a Bénard cell actually is it's named after Henri Bénard, who ran this experiment in the early 1900s where he takes this shallow layer of fluid and heats it evenly from below while the top stays cool. You now have this temperature difference across the entire layer where also below a critical threshold, nothing dramatic is happening. Heat crosses the layer by conduction, which is handed molecule to molecule, and the fluid stays kind of visibly still. But when pushed past the threshold, conduction can't keep up, and the fluid starts to move in bulk. Hot fluid begins to rise. It cools at the tops, sinks, and rises again, but it doesn't do so at random. It locks into a regular array of cells, rolls, or hexagons, each with a steady circulating loop. This would go towards, what were you saying? What was the word? Laminar flows, I think you mentioned.
So there's the laminar flow becomes turbulent, and that's that's part of the interest that Sayre has in revisiting Lucretius, because Lucretius kind of points out some of these things in his own poetic way. But, here the turbulence is well organized and forms these repeating patterns. So, it's literally the order out of chaos promised by the book.
The thing to hold on to here, what connects us to the capital, is that this order exists only when the heat itself keeps flowing. You cut the energy and the pattern collapses. The fluid goes still, and that's what makes a dissipative structure rather than an equilibrium structure like a crystal. A crystal sits there once it's formed, and it doesn't need anything. It doesn't need an input per se, where the Bénard pattern is sustained order, which is paid for by this continuous throughput, the continuous throughput of heat, which heat goes to energy. Once it stops paying the cost of heat, it dies. And Prigogine makes this exact contrast in some of the quotes that I'm going to read in a moment. I did want to bring up this. This is not exactly the perfect one-to-one because there are some caveats, but if you think about Saturn's North Polar hexagon, I'm sure people have seen this as kind of the six-side. It's like something that the Cassini probe first photographed. The caveat here is that it's probably not exactly this thermal Bernard convection, what would be like a standing wave in a polar jet stream with this six-lobed instability point that reproduces. It's been reproduced rather in spinning tank experiments. The point that survives all of this is the one that matters, though. It's the hexagonal order arising spontaneously across very different fluid systems, which is exactly this generality of dissipative structures that Prigogine claims. We can observe the same thing at the planetary scale, and it's photographable, and it emphasizes like this far from equilibrium pattern that emerges out of chaos, if you will. I'm going to read from page 143. Classical thermodynamics leads to the concept of equilibrium structures, such as crystals. Bernard cells are structures too, but of a quite different nature. That is why we have introduced the notion of dissipative structures to emphasize the close association, at first paradoxical in such situations, between structure and order on the one side and dissipation or waste on the other. Another quote from page 143. We have seen in chapter 4 that heat transfer was considered a source of waste in classical thermodynamics. In the Bernard cell, it becomes a source of order. The inversion here is that waste becomes order and dissipation becomes structure. And this is the thing that classical thermodynamics identified as pure loss is the very source of organization given the correct or the right boundary conditions. Far from equilibrium generates form through the very mechanism that classical physics treated as form's enemy itself. If you want to look at this relative to our manuscript, the Bernard cell is Henri Atlan's vortex. We look at this in chapter 2 of the manuscript. Prigogine opens the dissipative structure to the crystal, where equilibrium structures such as crystals. Atlan opposes the vortex to the crystal on the crystal smoke axis. The same figure, the same opposition. The Bernard cell is Atlan's vortex, form maintained through continuous transformation, organization by metabolizing disorder rather than resisting it. This is the physics behind the crystal smoke axis that we built a big foundation of the manuscript on. The crystal is the dead end of equilibrium order, and the Bernard cell or vortex is the living dissipative structure, and that's the cleanest bridge from order out of chaos back into our manuscript. Here's something interesting: bifurcation and the role of history. At these bifurcation points, the system's future is genuinely undetermined. Small fluctuations can tip it into qualitatively different regimes. I would posit maybe that points to something like micropolitics. I don't know if Prigogine and Stengers would necessarily want to go that far, but that's a claim we can perhaps consider. Prigogine reads this as the thermodynamic basis for his genuine historical contingency, and I will read from page 161. It is very important to emphasize that the behavior of such systems depends on their history. Until now, history has been commonly used in the interpretation of biological and social phenomena, but that it may play an important role in simple chemical processes is quite unexpected. So history is not an embellishment we add to physical systems to humanize them. History is in the chemistry, and even simple chemical reactions become path dependent. What they become depends on what they were. The classical separation collapses from the physics side of that, where timeless physics versus historical biology and society, and that wall evaporates. Now, there's a couple of lines from Frank Herbert that I want to mention from Dune, Book 1. These are both from Paul Moadib. I am at the fulcrum. I cannot give without taking, and I cannot take without giving. That's the first one. Number 2, the vision of time is broad, but when you pass through it, time becomes a narrow door. The fulcrum is a bifurcation point. A fulcrum is the pivot of a lever, the one place where a small force decides which way everything tips. That's Prigogine's bifurcation exactly. The unstable point where the future is undetermined and a single fluctuation selects the branch. Paul is therefore not predicting from outside. He is standing on the pivot. the place of maximal sensitivity where his passage is amplified into divergent futures. Give and take is the conservation ledger, and it is the petit mort a. I cannot give without taking, and I cannot take without giving is the thermodynamic law of the fulcrum. There's no transformation without cost. The two arms of the lever move together. To tip the future one way is to spend the potential and foreclose the other way. Every giving, a future produced petite naissance, is a taking, a potential consumed petite mort. The move from broad vision to narrow door is the bifurcation itself resolving. Before you pass through, the future is broad. The full fan of branches is available. The metastable potential. Every regime is still possible. Passing through is the irreversible act of actualization, and it collapses this breath to a single branch with the rest foreclosed. And that's the spider future seen from the inside. Prescience does not read the broad future. It makes it by narrowing it, and the passage consumes the very breath that had made the vision itself possible. For history specifically, this is the bifurcation theory of history in two sentences. History is the irreversible selection of one trajectory from a broad space at unstable pivots, where the selection bends the conditions and shuts the other doors. So path dependence and an openness that is only before you pass through. Fluctuations become productive. The classical image is that fluctuations are noise, deviations from the deterministic trajectory that statistical mechanics averages out. Prigogine's image is that fluctuations are productive, and what gets amplified at the bifurcation point are what gets amplified at bifurcation points to produce new structures. Order doesn't emerge despite chaos, it emerges through, and the book title From Order Out of Chaos is literal. The interesting bridge to Simondon here is metastability equals far from equilibrium charge, a poised but not collapsed system that holds tensions resolvable under the right perturbation. Transduction equals propagation of structure through a metastable medium, the Bernard pattern spreading across the fluid. The pre-individual equals the reservoir of fluctuations and tensions that has not yet individuated. Associated milieu equals the environment co-produced with the dissipative structure. The Bernard cell, for example, does not exist apart from its heat gradient. The refusal of hylomorphism here, which is the deepest convergence, where both reject form imposed on passive matter. Form emerges from metastable conditions, and it is not stamped from the outside. This goes back to the headline statement we opened with in Prigogine's introduction: matter no longer the passive substance, but associated with spontaneous activity is the refutation of hylomorphism. Passive matter awaiting form is the mechanistic and the hylomorphic picture at once. Active matter that self-organizes is Simondon's metastable pre-individual. So it's the same claim, physics on the one side, ontology of individuation on the other. And it interestingly lines up with Anne Sauvignargues, who we discussed, I think, in chapter 1 of the working manuscript, where Simondonian individuation produces information, so neg entropy, at the same time as it dissipates the system through entropy. This is the dissipative structure stated in Simondon's vocabulary. Active matter makes structure by spending potential, and the manuscript is already standing at this convergence. Order Out of Chaos names the physics side for us. Prigogine and Stengers anchor this convergence technically when they describe what happens at the near bifurcation points, and I'll read from page 180. Particles separated by macroscopic distances become linked. Local events have repercussions throughout the whole system. Such long-range correlations appear at the precise point of transition from equilibrium to non-equilibrium. From this point of view, the transitions resemble a phase transition. So this quote is transduction in physics vocabulary: local events with global repercussions. Macroscopic distance particles linked. Phase transition. The phase transition framing is exact. It's the canonical example from Simondon of water and ice, and I think The local events with global repercussions again points to micropolitics. The same quote is also the statistical hinge here. When the law of large numbers fails and fluctuations reach the scale of the mean, the bell curve stops describing the system. The Gaussian is equilibrium statistics. Far from equilibrium, you get power laws. Deviation stops becoming error and becomes the event. Prigogine and Stengers give Simondon his physics. We could flag there's some stuff with Simondon and Pierce that's kind of interesting relative to firstness as like qualitative immediacy and pre-relational potential, that mapping onto the pre-individual, secondness or brute reaction onto the bifurcation event, thirdness or mediation habit and law onto the dissipative structure that locks in and after the bifurcation. Prigogine's physics is giving the Peircean categories kind of an interesting thermodynamic substrate if you want to take that, if you want to go down that route. The gradient as physics, so the dead labor, living labor differential isn't a metaphor borrowing physics for rhetorical force. It actually is the physics itself because capital is a dissipative structure. It maintains form, so value form, profit, and accumulation only by continuously importing the far from equilibrium charge of living labor. It radiates the dead remainder into the environment, so that's consumed substrate like exhausted bodies and ecological drawdown. Think Tomba's Rückwirkung as boundary condition, where each historical layer of accumulated dead labor sets the boundary conditions for what kinds of patterns living labor can actually produce. And the basin of attraction is reshaped by every prior amortization. Path dependent in Prigogine's strict sense, exactly as the chapter 5 quotation asserts for chemical systems. From physics to the social, Prigogine and Stengers apply their own framework, and there's a crucial methodological point here. They do not leave it to readers to extrapolate to social and economic systems. They make the bridge themselves with 2 examples. And I think this is really fascinating. This is actually something we got into, I believe, in the discussion about of Richard Seaford's book briefly. And so the image that they use is the steamship and the production of demand. The first example refuses the orthodox demand curve framing directly, and this is page 196. Such innovations transform the environment in which they appear, and as they spread, they create the conditions necessary for their own multiplication, their niche. Second quote from page 196. The creation of a demand and even of a need for this demand to fulfill often appears as correlated with the production of the goods or techniques that satisfy the demand. This is the entire manuscript critique of supply-demand orthodoxy articulated in a physics book. Innovation does not satisfy pre-existing demand. Innovation produces the demand it allegedly satisfies. The steamship doesn't fulfill a latent need for fast transport. It produces the niche in which fast transport becomes a need. I have a joke that I'm often said about the law of supply and demand, which is those with the supply make the demands, which I think they kind of point to here. Supply and demand are not facts the market discovers. They are co-produced by the same dynamics that produce the technology. To draw the example from the Prigogine book, termites without masterminds, which goes against the Hayekian spontaneous order. There's a contrast of 2 ontologies here of social order. One is the Aristotelian hierarchical one, where there's the king, the architect, the contractor, the workers. So the mastermind and command flows downhill. The second is the termite statistical, where local interactions produce collective patterns, and there is no global plan. So the book actually has some interesting illustrations, and they're relative to, I think, this example of termite larvae, who I think emit some type of like a pheromone or something, and this actually attracts the rest of the hive or what have you, the rest of the colony. Maybe I'll put some of the screenshots into the show notes for the patrons so they can see that. But I'll read from page 205. There seems to be no mastermind behind the construction of the termite's nest. None of these interactions refer to any global task, being all purely local. The Hayekian reading wants to grab this as confirmation of spontaneous order, with no mastermind, and the implication being that government should stay out of the way. But Prigogine and Stengers immediately add the qualifier that kills this kind of appropriation, and that's going to be on page 205. Such a description necessarily implies averages and reintroduces the question of stability and bifurcations. The termite order is spontaneous, but in a narrow sense, that there's no central planner. It's not spontaneous in the Hayekian sense, that is, would imply self-arising without substrate. The pattern still requires gradient dynamics, stability conditions, bifurcation threshold, and the consumption of an environment. Hayek strips the second half of that, but Prigogine and Stengers maintain both. Self-organization is real. Spontaneous order is its ideological packaging, and that move occludes the substrate consumption. The implications for our manuscript is that both examples land on the anti-orthodox positioning that we're going with, where supply-demand framing equals dissipative structure illusion, spontaneous order framing equals strips the substrate consumption. Prigogine and Stenger state the manuscript's thesis themselves in passing in the obvious extension of their framework. Micropolitics as the dangerous fluctuation. The dangerous fluctuation is one that Prigogine himself states, and I will read from page 206. States of the system in which all individual initiative is doomed to insignificance on the one hand, and on the other, bifurcation regions in which an individual, an idea, or a new behavior can upset the global state. Think of it as two registers of political existence. One, stable regimes where individual action is absorbed by the system's nonlinear stability mechanisms. Individual initiative is doomed to insignificance, the existential register of life under capitalist realism. Two, bifurcation points. Here, polarity reverses. Individual fluctuations can be amplified and tip the entire system. Now, the philosophically loaded qualification from page 206 is that amplification obviously does not occur with just any individual, idea, or behavior, but only with those that are dangerous. That is, those that can exploit to their advantage the nonlinear relations guaranteeing the stability of the preceding regime. The claim is rigorous. A revolutionary fluctuation is not just any departure from a steady state. It's specifically the kind of departure that exploits the mechanisms by which the prior regime maintained itself. The dangerous fluctuation uses the existing nonlinearities against the existing stability. So you can think Trontes within and against capital, but articulated in physics. And this also connects to Deleuze and Guattari's micropolitics, as well as Tomba on the levers of change forged within the conditions they undo. It also explains why most fluctuations don't propagate, because the system absorbs them. Only fluctuations that have found the system's own non-linearity, that have in some sense, learned the gradient can be amplified to regime change scale. And the connection to our manuscript, this grounds the productive petit mort. The manuscript ties the productive version explicitly to Atlan's second temporal mode, self-organization through noise. So back to the logic of price and markets. The price is not what the system knows. The price is the local register of what the system is doing to gradients. Hayek's market as distributive cognition becomes market as Bernard cell. Pattern that takes into account its gradients in the only way far from equilibrium systems take anything into account, by amortizing the differences that make the taking into account possible. The resonance with Simondon is that he insists the individual can't be thought apart from its associated milieu. Perception and structuration are co-emergent with the milieu and not added to a pre-individual that encounters a world. Prigogine is the physics side statement of that same thesis, where energy that learns is energy that is individuating. I spoke earlier about the sort of costs associated with observation, relative to Paul Muad'Dib, and the idea that's presented in Dune Messiah is that absolute prediction is lethal. And the thesis of Dune Messiah is stated in the opening framing essay attributed to Bronzo of Ix. We know that this moment of supreme power contained failure. There can be only one answer. The completely accurate and total prediction is lethal. Quote 2 from Bronzo of Ix, only through the lethal nature of prophecy can we understand the failure of such enormous and far-seeing power. Where Laplacian prediction is the godlike view from inside a reversible deterministic system, Herbert illustrates that as the trap itself, where prediction equals closure equals the heat death of historicity. The chaos in chaos out of order is precisely what must be preserved to keep the future open. Bifurcation requires fluctuation. Prescience that eliminates fluctuation eliminates bifurcation. Eliminating bifurcation in turn eliminates futurity itself. Paul himself registers this to, and this is another quote from Dune Messiah, I succumb to the lure of the oracle. Could it be that the oracle made the future? Had he exposed his life to some web of underlying threads, trapped himself there in that long ago awakening, victim of a spider future which even now advanced upon him with terrifying jaws? The spider future image, the future that advances upon its predictor with jaws. The oracle doesn't simply describe the future, the oracle creates the future by collapsing the bifurcation space into a single fixed trajectory. Total prescience, therefore, equals total amortization, a system that no longer has fluctuations to amplify because every fluctuation has been seen, neutralized, and built into the foreseen path. The predictor then becomes the very gradient that made prediction possible. Herbert has his own fluid dynamics here relative to convections and confluences. When Paul tries to explain prescience to Stilgar in Irulan, and this is from Dune Messiah as well, there's no cause and effect in the oracle. Causes become occasions of convections and confluences, places where the currents meet. Also from Dune Messiah, this is Edric the Guild Navigator. As water creatures stir up the currents in their passage, so the prescient stir up time. Convections, confluences, currents that meet. This is the Bernard Cell vocabulary. Herbert describing prescience as the operation of a far from equilibrium fluid system. The oracle does not obey Newtonian causal laws because the oracle is not modeling this Laplacian trajectory. It's reading the local pattern of convection currents in a metastable medium. Causes do not produce effects in linear succession. They become occasions, so Whiteheadian, processual, and dissipative. So Frank Herbert already is kind of intuiting Prigogine's structural picture before the theory exists, and the Dune universe is built around this far from equilibrium ontology, and that's why Paul's prescience actually traps him. Every act of reading collapses the convection pattern into this fixed trajectory, eliminating metastability that made the pattern itself legible. So the oracle destroys its own substrate. Where this pays off, I think, is there's two classical demonologies. One is Laplace's demon, who we've spoke about already, but there's also Maxwell's demon. Laplace's demon is total predictive access from outside. Maxwell's demon is costless sorting at the gate. And Paul is the figure in whose tragedy that collapse becomes legible. Laplace, the first demon, total predictive access from outside, given complete instantaneous state, the demon that computes all past and future. This is the philosophical ancestor of the Walrasian Hayekian image of the market as distributed cognition, the system that achieves what no individual could, but in principle reconstructs the same external view. Prigogine and Stengers refuse this head-on page 271. When faced with these unstable systems, Laplace's demon is just as powerless as we. So not a statement about cognitive limitation, a statement that the demon's position is structurally incoherent for unstable systems. There is no outside from which total prediction could be performed because specifying the initial conditions would require infinite information, and information has a cost associated with it. Looking at Maxwell, costless sorting at the gate, not the predictor outside, but the agent who differentiates a population, building gradients out of statistical noise. The orthodox apologetic for market function. The market sorts, maintains differences, and allocates without paying. Prigogine and Stengers take this up twice, first critically and then technically. The critical move is from page 175. Often biological order is simply presented as an improbable physical state created and maintained by enzymes resembling Maxwell's demon. If we accept this, biology would be in the position described by Stahl. The laws of nature allow only death. The counter move is that life is not gate tending against entropy. Life is what entropy production looks like in the right far from equilibrium conditions. The Maxwellian framing is preserving the classical opposition between order makers and entropy makers, and it's treating organized systems as exceptions, holding the line. Far from equilibrium dissolves this opposition. The gate tender is the gradient, and this is the technical move from page 283, and there's two quotes that I'll read from there. We need a kind of Maxwellian demon to perform the velocity inversion, and Maxwell's demon has a price. Second quote, there is one exception at time to H jumps upward, but that corresponds to the very moment at which the system is open. We can invert the velocities only by acting from the outside. The second sentence is where the passage earns its keep. The demon's intervention is the opening of the system. The price is not paid abstractly somewhere else, but it's paid at the moment of the intervention, structurally identical to the opening that makes the intervention itself possible. The demon can't stand outside without ceasing to intervene and cannot intervene without paying a price. The demon is constitutively inside whatever it sorts. The application for our manuscript is when we say capital is Maxwell's demon, the orthodoxy hears this as a compliment. Prigogine's double move refuses the framing and the praise, though. Capital is not the gate tender outside the gradient. Any sorting it performs carries constitutive price paid in the substrate being sorted. The petit mort a is the local transactional version of Landauer cost. Once both demons have collapsed, what does agency actually look like? Not prediction from the outside and not costless sorting at the gate. Anything you want to intervene with? I'll take a moment because I've been talking for a long, long time.
One thing I was thinking about with Maxwell's demon, Laplace's demon, is it made me think about Nietzsche's demon. One of the ways in which Nietzsche conceives the eternal return, right, is, I forget exactly the quote, but he's basically like, what if you were visited by a demon in your darkest moment? And the demon told you you would relive your life as you have without any possibility of change. So this is supposed to be kind of like an ethical challenge. Do you exult in the possibility of, do you feel joy at the prospect of, reaching your highest heights? Or does it produce nothing but existential dread and hopelessness and resignation? So it's kind of this interesting idea, again, about questions of reversibility and irreversibility, stuff that I hadn't thought about, right, related to these other two demons, these scientific conceptual personae. So Nietzsche's demon kind of asking us about becoming worthy of the event, as Deleuze might say. Because obviously for Nietzsche, you can't separate your lowest lows from the possibilities of your highest highs. You got to experience them. You got to experience the lows to have the highs. Otherwise, you're if you're deadening your ability to feel the lows, you're cutting off your ability to feel on the other end of the spectrum. Now, obviously, that doesn't preclude the fact that all the events that make up a life would have these bifurcation points, right? These singularities that you've been discussing. But of course, this is the thought experiment in the same way that Laplace's demon and Maxwell's demon are these kinds of thought experiments, these positionings of thought with respect to phenomena. Here, though, obviously Nietzsche's demon and thought experiment is less of a scientific question, obviously, more of a philosophic, ethical type of question, a question about life and our feelings about life which of course are always suspect, right? Nietzsche does warn us about judging life from within life. It tells us about a type of life and not about life. Anyway, I know that's a little bit to the side of what we're discussing, but I wouldn't be surprised. Nietzsche was pretty well read in the history of materialism and science, even though that wasn't a specialty by any means, right? It is interesting to think about the role of these demons in the history of thought, because another demon we could think of is Descartes' evil genie, right? Evil spirit, who is potentially controlling my perceptions, my senses, and lying to me, which of course he has to reject because God is not a deceiver for him. It's not an attribute of God.
At some point, we'll have to do an episode on Vonnegut's Timequake, where
Mm-hmm.
people have to like relive the entire last year of their life, but they have no agency to act differently. And it's a really great book that I enjoy a lot. To hit on something big or something that's a big component of the manuscript drawn from Baudrillard, and this is irreversibility, or the entropy barrier, which is sort of the temporal payload. Equilibrium as the foil. Central thermodynamic ontological claim here is at maximum entropy, behavior is necessarily random. This is what defines the equilibrium state, against which any structure must be understood as a held open exception. To read a quote from chapter 9, page 271, let us emphasize only that at equilibrium, whenever entropy reaches its maximum, these objects must behave randomly. The corollary is irreversibility itself emerges from instability, and also from page 271, chapter 9. It also seems quite remarkable that irreversibility emerges, so to speak, from instability, which introduces irreducible statistical features into our description. Indeed, what could an arrow of time mean in a deterministic world in which both future and past are contained in the present? What could an arrow of time mean in a world where future and past are already contained in the present? The classical fantasy doesn't merely ignore time, it makes time inconceivable. Time becomes a real and constitutive feature of nature only when the system is genuinely open, when its future is not pre-given in its present. The infinite information barrier. The second law is not a statement about probability or our ignorance. It is a statement about what can and cannot be physically realized. Chapter 9, page 277. An infinite entropy barrier separates possible initial conditions from prohibited ones. Because this barrier is infinite, technological progress never will be able to overcome it. We have to abandon the hope that one day we will be able to travel back into our past. Page 278. To understand the origin of this barrier, let us return to the expression of the H quantity as it appears in the theory of Markov chains. To each distribution, we can associate a number, the corresponding value of H. We can say that to each distribution corresponds a well-defined information content. The higher the information content, the more difficult it will be to realize the corresponding state. What we wish to show here is that the initial distribution prohibited by the second law would have an infinite information content. That is the reason why we can neither realize them nor find them in nature. To each distribution corresponds a well-defined information content. The initial distribution prohibited by the second law would have an infinite information content. That is the reason why we can neither realize them nor find them in nature. This resolves Lock-Schmidt's reversibility paradox. The classical objection would be that since microscopic dynamics are time reversible, every entropy increasing trajectory has a perfectly valid time reverse twin that actually decreases entropy. So why don't we see the reverse? Boltzmann's answer is that those states are improbable, always comes across as a sort of hedge, but Prigogine offers us something stronger. Those states are unrealizable. Their reverse trajectory exists in the equations, but not in the world itself. Information required to specify it diverges to infinity. Irreversibility as fundamental. Page 285, irreversibility is either true on all levels or on none. It cannot emerge as if by a miracle by going from one level to another. So this inverts the classical hierarchy. Orthodoxy treated reversibility as fundamental and irreversibility as an emergent embarrassment. For Prigogine, the polarity goes the opposite direction, where time-oriented behavior at the macroscopic level expresses a broken time symmetry at the microscopic level, and irreversibility goes all the way down. This would show that petit mort A is as a thermodynamic operator, and the move that ties it all together, the petit mort A, le petit mort, and objet A plus amortization is the local accounting of Prigogine's entropy barrier. And our manuscript makes the irreversibility move in our own words. In chapter 1, every act of production, every coupling, every metabolic transfer is a petit mort, an irreversible expenditure of what cannot be recovered. Each exchange is doing three things at once. One, it erases the qualitative information that would be needed to undo it, le petit mort, the small death, the irreversibility. Two, generates a lost qualitative remainder that becomes the cause of subsequent desire, the objet A, what circulation produces as its constitutive lack. Three, ratchets the system incrementally towards equilibrium, so amortization, the gradient consumed, the dead labor balance increased. And it's all grounded by Prigogine, not purely psychoanalytic and not purely economic. It has its own physics. Each transaction is a Prigoginian barrier crossing, a small radiation of qualitative information into noise. The contribution is actually a better, I think I might have been originally thinking about absolute zero, where chapter 1 is using absolute zero as the physical analogy for the petit mort A, which is a limit approach but never reached. Prigogine's infinite entropy barrier is the better analogy. So absolute zero is a temperature floor. The barrier is specifically about irreversibility, which is what petit mort A actually is. To quote Prigogine, we have to abandon the hope that one day we will be able to travel back into our past. So that's the petit mort A stated as physics. The unreachable limit is unreachable because the exchange cannot be undone, not merely because some quantity can't be driven to zero. What we'll probably end up doing is adding Prigogine's entropy barrier alongside absolute zero or replacing it entirely. And that's kind of what I think reading this book is contributing on the manuscript side. There's some interesting stuff related to Richard Seaford's book that we discussed recently, which I'll go through. Let's see. So what is it? Antimoibe? I'm not very good at these Greek pronunciations. Because Heraclitus is like all things are this antimoibe of fire. And Seaford is reading that antimoibe. I'm not sure exactly what the pronunciation is, but he's reading that as an exchange equivalence and tracing its emergence to the historical development of coinage. So if you read that through Prigogine, that fragment becomes a thermodynamic statement because money is the technology by which this qualitative singularities are converted into homogeneous equilibrating medium. And that conversion can't be undone because the informational pathway has already been radiated into the environment. So the Moira to the Crayon to the Ananke arc tracks this archaic intuition of equilibrium fate that Prigogine is articulating thermodynamically. Hayek says, for example, that price signals compress information, markets aggregate dispersed local knowledge into an efficient scalar. But through Prigogine and Seaford, that picture becomes inverted, where price signals don't compress information, they actually destroy it. Price aggregates only by annihilating the qualitative information that any non-market coordination would need. Hayek's compression is Prigogine's irreversible erasure. What Hayek refers to as information, Prigogine would call equilibrium. My joke, the law of supply and demand, is that those with the supply make the laws, and that exposes the passive voice that's baked into the orthodox phrase, right? Because demand as curve gets puned into demand as ultimatum, and restoring the agency that the textbook framing was designed to occlude, because it's dispersed sovereignty in a kind of vernacular voice. Now, if we look at this Baudrillardian aspect of symbolic reversibility versus thermodynamic irreversibility, there's a sort of productive tension. The connection, there's some real friction here. In symbolic exchange and debt, the symbolic order is the order of reversibility, where gifts compel counter gifts, sacrifices compel sacrifices, deaths are reciprocated, and time is cyclical. Capital attempts to abolish the symbolic reversibility by making everything equivalent through monetary exchange. Capital's pretense of equivalent exchange is the lie, though. What actually happens is one-way accumulation. The symbolic reciprocity that would close the loop is destroyed or foreclosed. For Prigogine, irreversibility is the structural truth of nature. For Baudrillard, capital's pretense of reversible exchange makes the terminal irreversibility of accumulation, while what it destroys is the symbolic genuine reversibility. So the cycle of singular irreversibilities, so gifts, deaths, and sacrifices, which are specific, right? Specific versus the general equivalence of bodies and so forth, right? That we discussed with Richard Seifer relative to coin exchange, where the flattening of difference, there's a democratization of exchange where everything becomes quantitative and the qualitative information is lost. And I think that's what the critique was pointing to relative to Hayek, is that the specific information of the input is what is destroyed in the exchange or what have you. This body, this time, like this specific, like the hexaity almost, the thisness of it. But they're both being Prigogine and Baudrillard, target the same enemy, the classical mechanical economic image of the timeless equivalent exchange. The sharpest synthesis of this would be something like thermodynamic irreversibility is a substrate that gets destroyed by the price-mediated illusion of reversibility. The Walrasian equilibrium pictures lie about both, where it's lying about physics because it ignores the production of entropy, and two, it lies about the symbolic because it abolishes the gift, death, fatality. And a double lie about time, and the lies are intricately related because the destruction of symbolic reversibility is the thermodynamic erasure operating at the level of social meaning. And we can bring up Bataille briefly, where Bataille operates at a space between them because general economy equals explicitly thermodynamic, so solar excess, dissipation, and the part that must be expended. But the occur share is also the singular irreversibility that ritualized expenditure through the sacrifice, the festival, war, and eroticism, that those try to honor the part that can't be amortized into equivalent exchange. Bataille's occur share equals Baudrillard's symbolic equals Prigogine's qualitative information radiated into noise. So 3 different vocabularies for the same fundamental remainder. But I'll stop there because I think that's a good stopping point to see if you have any interventions you want to make.
I mean, one thing that I can't help but think about in relation as like a secondary work is Thomas Nail's book on Marx in Motion that we reviewed and discussed with him. So much of what's going on in this work is like taking up from that, but also sort of taken to the extreme this question of motion and looking at questions of irreversibility. Just a thought that one of the interlocutors could be Nail's studies, because he's been very keyed in on this question, and I wonder how well it might fit in with something like this.
Yeah, I think your instincts are spot on. I can't remember if we spoke about it in that episode or where, but we have mentioned, I think, something that points towards this notion that the sort of open system of capital requires constant throughput. You know, we do measure something like the velocity of money, and I think the velocity of money does point to that sort of
Mm.
relationship, that sort of true aspect. Because, right, there's also like relative to debt and credit, there has to be a constant generation of new credit and debt to propel the system. And if money isn't circulating and if things aren't circulating fast enough, like there always has to be more debt created at a pace to sustain. It's almost like this, what they point to as the externalization of entropy in a certain sense. We're displacing our entropy into the future by constantly borrowing time from the future, if that makes sense. Like claims
Hmm.
on claims on future production. More and more claims on future production have to be made and actualized in the distribution of credit, the creation of credit, in order to keep the system having an adequate amount of throughput. Otherwise, the debts become unsustainable. It's kind of like your caloric debt, or, you know what I mean, like the thermodynamic aspects of the individual, because the individual has its own internal entropy that it has to displace its internal entropy onto the environment. So by consuming other plants, animals, etc., right, this is a way that we are contributing, metabolizing out the external. We're creating entropy in the world through this metabolic process that is kind of almost like a neg entropy internally, if that makes sense. This kind of goes towards a little bit of these Gaussian distributions, the normal distribution, the bell curve, and the kind of equilibrium notion of supply and demand, like the classical approach to these, where prices sort of stabilize at equilibrium, right? That's the a priori claim of that line of thinking. And what's interesting is that Mandelbrot himself kind of worked through this. So he examined cotton prices, and what he found is that changes are not flatly Gaussian. What he observed is the tails are way too fat, and the moves that the bell curve says should never happen actually end up happening all the time. And his model has price changes follow this Levy stable distribution rather, with the
Hmm.
Gaussian as just this thin-tailed corner of that family. Below the Gaussian corner, the variance is not large but undefined, so risk equals standard deviation measures nothing. Aggregation never smooths anything out, and there is no typical size of a market move. So scale free, self similar across timescales, weird all the way down, not normal with occasional shocks, right? In terms of markets. It was ignored because the bell curve was this sort of load bearing thing, not because anyone hadn't refuted it. The whole
Hmm.
edifice, so Black Scholes, mean variance portfolios, value at risk, Basel, they need finite variance even to be defined. Stable distributions give no closed form option price, no finite risk number, and no clean optimization. But the field maintained this assumption that lets you compute over the one that's true. So Mandelbrot's line is that economists would rather be precisely wrong than vaguely right. The cost doesn't vanish, it accumulates and discharges at bifurcation. But I will mention for anyone that wants to look into this, there's Eugene Fama, who became the father of efficient market hypothesis, is very close to Mandelbrot, and his work in the 60s looking at fat-tailed stable hypothesis before building on the sort of Gaussian project anyways.
I was thinking about, when they turned to some of the philosophy throughout, I thought some of that was interesting, especially for our philosophical listeners. Some of the stuff that we obviously presupposed in our talk today, but I think it's pretty good reading. And one of the things that I like is the slow burn of the book, kind of building up to a lot of the stuff you worked through today. Building up to questions of heat from classical dynamics to irreversible processes to entropy, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, people that have enjoyed our discussions of Simondon, or just as an example, I think we'll get a lot out of just reading through the book. It doesn't really presuppose a lot of learning. So they do a good job of walking through the issues, setting them up, and explaining. And they have some pretty good diagrams too towards the end to make the self-organization of irreversible processes easy to grasp. I could see why this is one of those classic, I say now, classic references. It's still a staple reference and is, I wouldn't say it's my favorite read in terms of like effective reads, but it's definitely affective reads, right? I mean, it's not necessarily going to move your soul, but it's definitely good food for thought and is going to kind of walk you step by step. And for that, I think we still need those kinds of books, right? For the non-expert, which I am in this field, to tie it into, it still feels relevant for where science is headed in the 21st century. Obviously, you could say it's a little dated. Some of the stuff we might take for granted about complexity, self-organization, catastrophe, et cetera, right? I think that you and I might be biased, not just with what we read. Maybe in this day and age, we might think of these things as already acquired and assumed, but they walk you through the steps leading up to our current moment. And so for that, I think it's very helpful to get the bigger picture and then to be able to zoom in on their particular problem. I think one of the things you let off the episode saying that it can be lost on a reader, and I was kind of glossing over it, that it's not just a textbook, if you will, walking you through and this. It's also polemical. There is a polemic to it, and I think that's why I meant that part of it seems to be already given. We might already expect all of this, but at the time they're writing in '79, some of what they're saying is still intervening in the then current debates of physics. So there is a polemical side to it, and I thought that was good that you brought that out because I think it might easily be lost on us today reading.
Just to go back to your mention of Thomas Nail, who I think it's not immediately clear, but I think his work definitely points to a lot here. I do remember in our discussion with him that there's and it's like classical models of economics or even the marginal revolution, so to speak. These models, and we'll look at, I think the next reading that we're going to doing is on Alf Hornborg's The Power of the Machine. And I think Hornborg himself is very critical of these same models that are not like they're ignoring inputs like energy and externalities. And in our discussions with Nail, we did sort of talk about how it's almost analogous to my joke about those with the supply make the demands, because they sort of set, or the system sets the extent at which things are priced. These models don't price everything into so true costs are never calculated. The ecological cost, for example, is never really taken into account. If the ecological cost was taken into account, then like most corporations wouldn't be able to actually have any profit. I think like something like 99% of all companies would not have any profit. So it's really interesting that the way that this mirrors the kind of entropy, like the open systems, the displacement of entropy, etc. But I think these are questions that we're going to be working through with like the next 10 readings probably. So just stay tuned for that. Like I said, the next reading we're going to be looking at is Alf Hornborg's The Power of the Machine, which I'm really excited. I think he's one of the few contemporary thinkers that I have found that is really thinking along the same lines that I am. So if you don't have anything else, I think we can wrap up the episode there.
Sounds good.
That will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see you all next time.
The rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. quiet because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.